What happens when a country's wealth absolutely explodes, but its society rips right down the middle? Seriously, imagine building a rocket ship of progress, but half the passengers are tied to the exhaust pipes. Welcome to one of the most paradoxical eras in American history. Let's get into it.
But before continuing, we upload new history videos every day. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.
Think about your hometown for a second. Now, imagine its population doubling overnight. Literally twice the amount of people fighting for the exact same space, the exact same jobs, and the exact same resources. Total chaos, right? We'll apply that to an entire country. In just a single generation, the U.S. population multiplied by 2. A 100% increase crammed into this tiny historical window.
You know, we usually think of history as this slow, dusty evolution, right? Not this time. The late 19th century was an uncontrollable rocket ship of progress and massive disruption. It was convulsive, a violent, jarring shock to the system. The country essentially strapped itself to an economic engine moving way faster than its societal shock absorbers could ever handle. And this whole transformation happened so fast. We're talking just the closing decades of the 1800s, from the 1870s right up to the 1890s. Imagine the whiplash. If you were born at the start of this era, by the time you were an adult, you were living in a completely unrecognizable country. It's like history was put on fast forward. Okay, let's dive into this, because the sheer logistics of doubling a nation are staggering. It means you suddenly need twice as much of absolutely everything. Food, housing, infrastructure, jobs, you name it. When a population explodes this quickly, existing systems don't just strain, they totally shatter. Society had to invent entirely new ways to function, literally on the fly.
So here's the jarring reality we're dealing with. A massive demographic explosion compressed into just one generation on a scale no one had ever seen before. It is quite literally like trying to pour 2 gallons of water into a 1-gallon bucket. The spillover? Yeah, it's messy, it's chaotic, and it fundamentally rewrites the entire landscape.
Now, what's really interesting here is that you'd probably think cramming twice as many people into a country would stretch things way too thin, right? Like it would make everyone poorer. But no, the exact opposite happened. Alongside this huge demographic surge came a mind-boggling economic boom. The national wealth didn't just grow, it exploded vertically.
And we're not talking about a modest little uptick in GDP. Oh no. We are talking about national coffers overflowing faster than anyone could even count. The late 19th century unlocked a scale of wealth expansion the country had absolutely never seen. That rocket ship we talked about, it was generating an unimaginable fortune as it flew.
But here is where that rocket ship fundamentally starts to fracture. With a surging population and all this explosive wealth, you'd logically expect a rising tide to lift all boats, wouldn't you? Yeah, that is not the story of this era. Instead of everyone getting rich together, this immense pressure forged 2 completely separate, distinct classes.
2 entirely separate worlds, rising right side by side. On one side, you've got unimaginable glamour, vast fortunes, and an elite status rivaling European royalty. We're talking barons building these sprawling, massive mansions on Fifth Avenue. But on the other side, an exploding working class, locked into gritty, hard-scrabble survival, just crammed into Lower East Side tenements. 2 realities sharing the exact same geography, but living totally different existences.
Just let the immense gravity of that societal split sink in for a second. This wasn't just your everyday run-of-the-mill inequality. It wasn't about, your neighbor having a slightly nicer house. This was an unprecedented chasm, a gulf so wide that these 2 sides could barely even see, let alone understand, each other's daily reality.
As one observer put it, they were separated by a gulf of experience and circumstance that was unprecedented in American life. I mean, they didn't breathe the same air, they didn't share the same fears, they might as well have been living on completely different planets despite walking the exact same city streets.
And this is the ultimate paradox of the era, because both of these classes rose at the exact same time. You could not have that glittering slice of the elite without the massive, expanding working class driving the entire engine underneath it. The immense wealth and the extreme division, they were permanently locked together.
Which finally brings us to why we actually remember this time the way we do. See, when an era produces staggering, mind-blowing wealth, it's pretty easy to just paint it gold. It's easy to look back and only see the progress and the huge fortunes. But a golden surface is incredibly deceiving when the foundation underneath it is deeply cracked.
So the crucial point is, that's exactly why it's called the Gilded Age. Not the Golden Age, gilded. Because gilded means something is just covered thinly with gold leaf. It was a glittering surface of unprecedented wealth that purposefully masked a deeply divided, convulsive society. The gold was real, for sure, but it was paper thin.
Which leaves us staring at a really massive, high-stakes question about progress itself. When a society doubles in size and wealth absolutely explodes, but it creates this unprecedented gulf between the people actually living through it, when a so-called golden age is built on an illusion, who truly pays the price? Okay, let's just toss out those sanitized history lessons for a minute. You know the ones, that whole narrative of polite reformers calmly passing laws to just make America a better place. Yeah, that is a complete myth. The reality? It was an absolute powder keg. We're looking at a society stretched so unbelievably thin and pushed so incredibly hard that it was quite literally tearing itself apart. So in this explainer, we're cracking open the historical vault to look at the brutal, bloody, and desperate reality of America's industrial coming of age.
I want you to think about this for a second. What do exhausted child laborers, a horrific factory fire, and a deeply racist president all have in common? Well, they are all the defining ingredients of what we now call the Progressive Era. This wasn't just some dry chapter in a textbook, it was a literal fight for survival. And honestly, if you don't understand these three things, you really don't understand modern America. So let's uncover the truth here.
The absolutely crucial point to grasp is that the Progressive Era, which roughly spanned from the 1890s to the 1920s, was not some peaceful, optimistic march forward. Not at all. It was a period of intense, incredibly chaotic social and political reform. But it was born out of pure desperation. It was an emergency response to the absolute horrors of unchecked industrialization. The status quo had basically turned into a meat grinder, and society was desperately scrambling to hit the emergency stop button.
To really understand that level of desperation, we have to look at the 1890s under President Grover Cleveland. It was kind of like playing a board game where the richest player just gets to make up the rules as they go. That was America's unregulated capitalist machine. You could so easily find yourself working 14 hours a day in a suffocating, incredibly dangerous factory, standing right next to a 9-year-old child who's doing the exact same grueling labor you are. The wealth gap wasn't just wide, it was this massive chasm that threatened to swallow the working class whole.
And you know, when people are pushed to the brink like that, they fight back. Eugene Debs emerged as this massive, booming voice for a working class that literally had nothing left to lose. When he said he was for socialism because he was for humanity, he wasn't just casually debating abstract political theory. He was speaking directly to mothers and fathers whose bodies were literally being broken by the industrial machine for just pennies a day. For millions of Americans, the system wasn't just unfair, it was lethal. But here's the dark reality. Fiery speeches alone don't actually change laws. Usually, it takes the unimaginable to force a completely blind nation to finally open its eyes. The shift from abstract political debates to concrete, urgent reform was paved with the explosive, horrific daily realities of the most vulnerable people in the entire country.
146. That isn't just a number on a page. It is the death toll of one of the darkest, most entirely preventable tragedies in American history. It's the number of human lives violently cut short simply because human life was considered cheaper than factory output.
In 1911, a massive fire broke out at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York City. The workers inside, who were mostly young immigrant women, suddenly found that the exit doors had been locked by the factory owners. Why? Just to prevent them from taking unauthorized breaks or stealing scraps of fabric. Trapped in this absolute inferno, many of these women made the unimaginable choice to jump from the upper floor windows rather than burn alive. The sheer, undeniable horror of this happening right in the middle of a bustling city was the ultimate catalyst. The public just couldn't look away from the industrial slaughterhouse anymore.
And once the public was forced to look inside these factories, this fire threw a glaring spotlight on all sorts of other systemic abuses. They couldn't unsee the rampant, totally normalized exploitation of child labor, which quickly became this massive national scandal. We're talking about children, some as young as 5 or 6 years old, literally losing limbs in heavy machinery and developing black lung deep in the coal mines.
Meanwhile, the adults in these factories weren't just passively accepting their fate either. The working class was in a state of continuous, desperate rebellion. Back in 1894, you had the Pullman strike, which totally crippled the nation's railroads. Then in 1912, the Bread and Roses strike saw textile workers, mostly women by the way, demanding not just a living wage but actual human dignity. And by 1919, the Great Steel Strike brought hundreds of thousands of workers straight to the picket lines. This was relentless. The country was basically locked in a constant state of low-grade civil war between labor and capital.
So with cities burning, workers striking, and the very fabric of society unraveling, the federal government was finally forced to step into the ring. The era of presidents just sitting back, kicking their feet up, and letting the mega corporations run the country completely unchecked, that was over. Enter Theodore Roosevelt.
Teddy Roosevelt saw the writing on the wall. He realized that if capitalism didn't reform itself, and fast, it would inevitably fall to violent revolution. So his agenda was totally disruptive. He aggressively targeted the massive monopolies, the trusts, that completely controlled the American economy. He actually forced federal intervention in labor disputes. Like during the 1902 coal strike, he literally threatened to have the military take over the mines if the owners wouldn't negotiate with the workers. For the first time ever, the federal government was acting as a referee, rather than just a hired bodyguard for the ultra-rich.
But look, progress is almost never a straight line, right? The reformers of this era harbored some incredibly dark contradictions, and honestly, none were more glaring than President Woodrow Wilson. He was a man celebrated as the ultimate intellectual reformer, but he embodied a massive paradox that really defined the true limits of this entire era.
So, on the global stage, Wilson introduced what we now call Wilsonianism. Let's skip the heavy geopolitical jargon here. Put simply, this is just the doctrine that America has a moral obligation to spread democracy and basically act as the world's police force. He championed the idea of self-determination and freedom for people all around the globe. And on paper, it sounds incredibly noble, right? But here is where you get this massive, jarring disconnect. Abroad, Wilson championed global democracy and signed these massive labor laws protecting workers, things like the 8-hour workday for railroad workers and new restrictions on child labor. But at home, he was actively working to strip basic freedoms away from millions of Americans right in his own backyard.
The really dark, hidden truth of Wilson's presidency is his aggressive racism. As soon as he took office, Woodrow Wilson oversaw the strict racial segregation of the federal government. Think about that. Workplaces, restrooms, and cafeterias in federal agencies that had actually been integrated for decades were suddenly segregated again. He actively fired numerous black federal workers and deliberately denied the so-called progress of the era to black Americans. It turned out the progressive umbrella was strictly whites only.
And this brings us to the end of the decade, where that pressure cooker narrative we've been tracking reached its absolute boiling point. World War I had ended, returning soldiers were coming home expecting jobs, economic inflation was skyrocketing, and racial tensions, heavily inflamed by leaders like Wilson, were just a spark away from an explosion. The illusion of peaceful progress shattered completely.
1919. If there is one single year that perfectly encapsulates the chaotic, violent climax of the progressive era, it is absolutely this one. Systemic tension didn't just bubble, it totally boiled over into nationwide chaos.
Because in 1919, you had this massive working-class rebellion of the Great Steel Strike where over 350,000 workers walked off the job demanding basic rights. But that tragically collided with something even darker. The extreme economic anxiety and the deeply entrenched racism of the era combined to ignite a horrifying wave of violence.
This horrifying period became known as the Red Summer of 1919. It was a bloody, nationwide wave of white supremacist terrorism and racial riots that swept across dozens of American cities, everywhere from Chicago to Washington, D.C. You had black veterans, guys who had literally just returned from fighting for democracy over in Europe, being hunted in the streets at home. It is a permanent, deeply bloody stain on the era's legacy that completely shatters the idea that this was purely a time of enlightenment and reform.
Which leaves us with this final, unavoidable question. If the progress of this era was built on the backs of exploited children, dead factory workers, and federal segregation, who was the progressive era really for? It's a question that challenges absolutely everything we think we know about American history.